Good morning, Minister, Ambassadors, Your Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to the Royal Irish Academy, and we are delighted to welcome you to this seminar on Ireland's membership of the United Nations Security Council, which, as I'm sure you all know, commenced on the 1st of January 2021 and will end on the 31st of December this year. The seminar will provide a timely reflection on Ireland's membership and the issues on the agenda of the Council. As you are all probably aware, Ireland adopted the themes of building peace, strengthening prevention, ensuring accountability for its time on the Council. Membership of the Council is an honour, responsibility, and it is also a burden. Considerable resources have been deployed by the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin and by the Permanent Mission in New York. Preparation was detailed and thorough, but I think we all will realise that no one could have imagined the unprovoked and criminal invasion by Russia of Ukraine, and the need for the Security Council to address the issues arising from that conflict. This invasion will be the subject of the first panel discussion today. I would like to thank the Minister for agreeing to make the keynote address today. Could I take this opportunity to thank you and to congratulate you for the role you have played internationally, and you and also your colleagues and your officials in the department for your dedication and professionalism with which you all have carried out your duties with the Security Council. I would like to thank the Academy's Standing Committee on International Affairs, and in particular the outgoing chair, Professor Andrew Cottey, and the committee members, Dr. Ekaterina Yahoui and Colin Rafter, and the Royal Irish Academy staff member, Vanessa Carlswell. They organised this event for today and put a lot of work into it. Our thanks are also due to the colleagues in the Department of Foreign Affairs for their expertise in bringing this event together, especially Garrett O'Brien and Owen Duggan. I would now like to hand over to Dr. Cottey. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this event on Ireland and the UN Security Council. Again, I would also like to extend my thanks to the Academy staff, in particular Vanessa Carswell and the other members of the International Affairs Committee and the staff of the Department of Foreign Affairs who've been responsible for bringing this event together. And as I think people will be well aware, these types of events don't just happen without quite a lot of work in the back room. So it's my pleasure to introduce Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Defence, Simon Coveney TD. As mentioned, Mr Coveney is Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Defence. He's also the Deputy Leader of Fine Gael, served previously as Taoiseach from 2017 to 2020, and previously also as Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government, as well as Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine. Mr Coveney was elected first to the Dáil in 1998, and he served as a member of the European Parliament in 2004 to 2007. And I think I first met you, Minister, when you very kindly welcomed some of our UCC students to Brussels on a field trip to Brussels. And I recall at that point that you were working on the European Parliament's annual report on human rights. And I think it's fair to say that issues of human rights and also relations with Africa have been long-standing personal issues of yours. The other thing I would like to note is that this is certainly not the first time that you will have spoken at this podium, and you've been a very long-standing supporter of the Royal Irish Academy and its work in the field of international affairs, and the Academy is very grateful for that. So without further ado, I will hand the floor to Foreign Minister Simon Coveney. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And President, professors, excellencies, guests and friends this morning, thank you all for taking the time to be here. And firstly, I want to thank the Royal Irish Academy for organising this event and for giving me this opportunity to speak to you this morning at an important time as we come to the end of our term on the Security Council. But through its promotion of studies in sciences, humanities and social sciences, and its long-standing contribution to public debate, the RIA has played an invaluable role in the development of modern Ireland and continues to do so. I'm delighted to be speaking today about the UN Security Council and Ireland's term as an elected member from 2021 to 2022. A term which coincided with a symbolically important year, marking a centenary of independence for our own country. We've just over a month left on the Security Council. There's a lot of important work to do over the next 5 weeks or so, and Ireland will continue to be an active and vocal member until the very end of our term. Today's event provides a good opportunity to reflect on what Security Council membership has meant for Ireland, and to explore some of our work and achievements and indeed frustrations to date. In January of last year, shortly after we took up our seat, I spoke at an event like this, setting out the principles that would guide our work on the Council. Those principles, as has already been referred to, agreed by the government following our election by the UN General Assembly, were clear. Firstly, to build peace and to support and improve UN peacekeeping around the world. Secondly, to strengthen conflict prevention by addressing the factors that cause and drive conflict across the world. And thirdly, to ensure accountability, because those responsible for serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law cannot be allowed to enjoy impunity, regardless of how powerful or how large they might be. Above all, we wanted to help the Security Council fulfill its critical, important mandate, as laid out in the UN Charter, the maintenance of international peace and security. We believe that Ireland, as a small independent country with a deep and long-standing commitment to the UN, can continue to make a difference. The members of the General Assembly agreed, and at the elections in June of 2020, they placed a lot of trust in us. Looking back over the past 2 years, while I feel frustrated that the Security Council has been unable to do more on certain issues, including Ukraine, I feel a great sense of pride at what Ireland has managed to achieve as an elected member. On joining the Council, for example, we took on the role of co-penholder for the Syria humanitarian file, working in partnership with Norway. We volunteered for this role because we recognise the critical importance of the Security Council mandated cross-border mechanism, which provides life-saving aid to over 4 million people in the northwest of that country, trapped by circumstances. Our role as penholder required us to make sure that this critical mechanism could continue. And we knew that that wouldn't be easy, and believe me, it wasn't. For over a decade, the people of Syria have seen their country torn apart by an appalling conflict. The permanent members of the Council are deeply divided on the issue more broadly. The prospects for a renewal of the mechanism were certainly not good. But we believed that we could succeed by focusing on the concrete realities of the humanitarian situation on the ground, trying to leave the other, albeit important, politics aside. And through patient and careful diplomacy, working with Norway, who were fantastic partners, we managed to broker an agreement that was acceptable for all and to keep the life-saving aid operations running. That's a crossing that I visited twice over the last 2 years to fully understand the importance and the challenge of what we were trying to achieve. During our time on the Council, it has twice renewed the UN cross-border operation. This had a very real and tangible result for millions of vulnerable people who continue to be in an awful situation, not of their own making. We'll work until the very end of our term to help to keep that critical lifeline open, because of course it requires annual and perhaps even more than annual renewals now to continue that humanitarian operation, which is dozens of trucks per day of life-saving equipment, food, medicines, blankets, and so much more besides. Today, hundreds of Irish men and women around the world wear the UN blue helmet. They are quite rightly a source of great pride for Irish people, particularly me as their minister. Throughout our time on the Council, we've drawn on the experience and expertise of our defence forces and their unbroken record of service on UN peacekeeping for nearly 60 years. We have worked with our partners on the Council to shape the mandates of UN peacekeeping operations, doing what we can to make them more fit for purpose. They do need to evolve and change as the circumstances that they operate in do too. And last year, we led work on Resolution 2594, the Council's first ever resolution on peacekeeping transitions. And for what it's worth, the second ever resolution written by Ireland agreed at the UN. At the UN Security Council, I should say. The resolution, adopted unanimously and co-sponsored by all 15 Council members, will help to ensure that the hard-won gains of peace are protected when peacekeeping missions end. It puts the protection of civilians at the centre of the UN's planning when transitioning from military peacekeeping operations into civilian-led political missions in countries emerging from conflict. It shows that what we can achieve when the members of the Security Council act, think and work together. And it demonstrates how Ireland, a small country and an elected member, can make a real substantive contribution. The reality is now, every year, the Secretary General of the UN is required to produce a report in relation to peacekeeping transitions, ensuring that the UN, with all of its infrastructure, plans for an evolving situation involving many of its peacekeeping missions that in time can focus less on military engagement and more on state building, if you like. Perhaps a term that is overused, but I think you know what I mean. And these are not the only examples of the positive contribution that Ireland has made. Earlier this month, the Security Council adopted a resolution renewing its authorisation for the EU force in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Operation Althea. Ireland led work on this resolution. We were effectively the penholder, a challenging task in the current context and current tensions of Europe. We took on this role because we know that Operation Althea plays an indispensable role in safeguarding peace and security in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we were determined that it should be allowed to continue its work. And through careful and painstaking efforts, we secured unanimous support across the Security Council for the resolution, despite the fact that many predicted it would not happen. At a time of great uncertainty, the renewal sends an important message of support for the stability and security of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the wider Western Balkans region at a time when stability and security is needed. Last Friday, we gathered in Dublin to recognise the formal adoption of the political declaration on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas by 82 states. This declaration, the result of years of work led by Ireland, is a significant milestone, and I really want to recognise our disarmament team in terms of the work that they have done here. It's an important instrument. Endorsing states have committed to restrict or refrain from the use of explosive weapons in cities where civilian harm can be expected. And it builds on Ireland's humanitarian tradition, which has been central to the work on the Security Council over the past 2 years. The protection of civilians has been a fundamental priority in our engagement across multiple agendas, and for obvious reasons, given some of the horrors that we see on our screens these days. When we ran for election to the Security Council, we did not expect that Ethiopia, a country that we know well, would feature so prominently in our work. But as we took up our seat, we were compelled to act in response to the deteriorating conflict and the shocking suffering that it wrought. Ireland has a long history of partnership with Ethiopia, and I hope we'll have a future too, which remains the largest recipient of Irish aid funding. It's a country that we know very well and a relationship that we deeply value. But we simply could not allow the Security Council to look the other way. And so, over the past 2 years, Ireland has led the Council's engagement on this crisis. We consistently drew the Council's attention to the situation, calling multiple meetings and securing the adoption of 2 Council statements. Our motivation was always to ensure humanitarian access, to protect civilians, and to alleviate suffering and end violence. As many of you will know, our leadership role on this issue has had an impact on our bilateral relationship with Ethiopia. Nevertheless, I am convinced that we did the right thing at the right time. The agreement reached earlier this month by the Ethiopian government and the TPLF provides an opportunity to put an end to the violence and to ensure humanitarian assistance reaches those who desperately need it. But this is a conflict that, for many across the world, happened under the radar. Over 100,000 people have been killed in this conflict in that time, to give you a sense of the scale of the loss and suffering and brutality involved. As we leave the Security Council, Ethiopia will remain a priority for Ireland, and we will do what we can bilaterally and through the EU and the UN to support full implementation now of this peace agreement, which I hope can provide stability. In Ethiopia, as in so many other conflict situations, women suffer disproportionately. And we know from our own experience in Ireland that women can make an indispensable contribution to peacemaking when they have a seat at the table, if they have a seat at the table. Yet all too often, they are prevented from participating and from being part of decision-making when it matters. The women, peace and security agenda is a long-standing priority for Irish foreign policy, and it has been central to our work on the Security Council at all times. Here too, I think we have delivered results. As co-chair with Mexico of the Council's informal expert group on women, peace and security, Ireland has worked to ensure that the role of women has been at the heart of the Security Council's work over the last 2 years. We've helped to ensure that the Council's resolutions on women, peace and security are implemented effectively across the UN peacekeeping and political missions. At our initiative, Ireland, Mexico and Kenya formed a Women, Peace and Security Presidency trio, committing to using our respective Council presidencies to integrate women, peace and security fully into the Council's work across all thematic and country files. This set of commitments has been built upon and adopted by a further 9 Council members in their subsequent presidencies. We've pushed for the inclusion of women in UN-led peace processes. We have ensured that women's voices are heard at the Council and maintained an ongoing dialogue with grassroots women peace builders. Last year, during our Security Council presidency, we brought a record 16 women civil society briefers and leaders to the Council table to brief countries directly. That's never been done before. Our commitment to gender equality and women's participation has permeated through our work right across the Council's agenda. We've consistently sought to translate high-level commitments into practical reality, including, for example, in Afghanistan. Since the Taliban takeover of Kabul last year, we've seen an alarming and intolerable regression in respect of human rights in that country. Afghan girls have been shut out of schools again, and denied their right to education. But Ireland has used its seat on the Security Council to try to stand by Afghan women as best we can. We've maintained an ongoing dialogue with Afghan women activists, ensuring that their voice is heard in New York. We've helped to ensure that the mandate of UN missions in Afghanistan include strong provisions on women's rights. And standing alone, I'm afraid, we refuse to agree to an extension of the exemption to the UN travel ban that senior members of the Taliban had enjoyed. We believe that the Taliban, like others responsible for abuses or violations of human rights, must face accountability for their actions. Throughout our term on the Council, we have stood firm on the fight against impunity too, and used our membership to shine a light on serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. We have stood by the International Criminal Court as a pillar of international rules-based order, unlike many other countries who should know better, and encouraged closer cooperation between the court and the Security Council itself. In June, Ireland convened an ARIA meeting, which looked at how to optimise the relationship between those two institutions, which are so vital for international peace and security, and ensuring that we fight against impunity. In our work across the Council's agenda on Colombia to Myanmar, from Libya to Mali, we have promoted the rule of law and demanded justice for victims and survivors when it's been appropriate to do so. We've shone a light on the threats facing journalists in conflict situations, calling on states to protect media workers like Shireen Abu Akleh, killed in the occupied Palestinian territory in May. On Monday, the Security Council will hold its monthly meeting on the situation in Palestine. Ireland has consistently reiterated its firm commitment to a two-state solution, with a viable Palestinian state based on 1967 borders, living in peace and security alongside the State of Israel, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. The sad truth is that we are no closer to that goal than we were when we joined the Council at the start of last year. The security situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, has deteriorated sharply. Confrontations between Israeli forces and Palestinians continue, often in response to attacks by settlers or incursions into Palestinian villages by Israeli security forces. Can I say also that I want to condemn the attack that we're reading about this morning in Israel? Violence, terrorism is not the answer here to bring about change. And to the Israeli who lost his or her life, and to the families of those victims, I think 18 people seriously injured, of course we express our condolences. Can I say that Israeli settlement building, which is a clear violation of international law, continues to undermine the viability and territorial contiguity of a potential future Palestinian state. And Ireland and other countries need to speak up on that issue. The situation in the occupied Palestinian territory is, in my view, unsustainable. It is likely to deteriorate further if we do not establish a genuine political horizon. And while we must always stand up and condemn and criticise violence, we also need to put equal energy into trying to find new thinking to create that new political horizon that people can start believing in. We've done all we could on the Security Council to defend international law and to continue to uphold the possibility of a two-state solution in the future. Sadly, this is one of a number of areas where the Security Council has failed and continues to fail to fulfill its mandate. Last week, in Sharm el-Sheikh, we came dangerously close to a step backwards on climate emissions. Although the effects of climate change are now being felt in every corner of the planet, in every country and in every community, The need for close and careful international coordination to find a way through should not be underestimated. I wish to acknowledge the role played by my colleague, Minister Eamon Ryan, who worked tirelessly alongside the wider Irish delegation that involved multiple different government departments and other countries to ensure a historic agreement for loss and damage financing mechanisms last week. And I have to say, I think the role of Eamon Ryan has been completely underestimated here. And I know that because I was there. And it was built on the role that he personally played last year at COP26, where Eamon Ryan was at the centre of EU discussions in relation to planning for the concept of loss and damage funding in the future. And in my view, if it hadn't been for Eamon Ryan in terms of the political involvement that he had over the last 10 days or so, there may not have been an agreement amongst EU member states, which became the basis for agreement internationally on a commitment from wealthy countries like ours and others to commit to putting a loss and damage fund in place. We don't know how much yet, we don't know the shape of that yet, but the commitment is clear and it's there. And I think that Eamon Ryan, as an Irish government minister, was probably the central figure in bringing that about. And I think it's just important to say that because not a lot of other people do. These mechanisms will target those particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change that have already taken place in many countries. The links between climate change and conflict are well established, and they warrant the attention of the Security Council too. Last year, Ireland, acting as co-chair of the Council's informal expert group on climate and security, decided that we would try to do something about that. We worked in partnership with Niger, a country that understands this problem better than most because they're living it. Together, we led work on a draft resolution on climate and security that reflected the simple reality now facing countries like Niger, that climate change is increasingly driving insecurity and acting as a threat multiplier. Threats to international peace and security have evolved since the UN Charter was agreed back in 1945. And the Council has a responsibility to respond to those emerging and evolving challenges. Our resolution aimed to ensure that the Security Council could continue to fulfill its mandate effectively, taking account of climate change as a driver for conflict and insecurity. 113 countries co-sponsored that draft resolution. 113. I'm not sure I can remember a resolution that had that number. Maybe there is one this year. Some of the many experts in the room will probably point that out to me, but I'm not familiar with them. Unfortunately, one country decided to veto it, Russia. As I've said so often, the veto in many ways undermines the credibility of the Security Council itself. It has no place in the UN of today, in my view. And its use hinders the Security Council from effectively implementing its mandate and its responsibilities. The UN is notoriously difficult to reform, but change is possible. In April, Ireland was part of a core group of states led by Liechtenstein, of all countries, which is proof that small countries matter, which brought a veto initiative to the General Assembly, where it was supported by the wider UN membership. It now means that when the veto is used, the General Assembly automatically holds a debate requiring the Council to submit a report and invite the member state which used the veto to make that statement. In other words, they shine a light on the use of the veto and force a P5 country to come before the General Assembly to explain what they're doing and why, which makes it a little bit more difficult to use and improves accountability, at least somewhat. This mechanism, a small but significant step towards increased scrutiny of veto use, has already been used, I'm glad to say, on a number of occasions this year. We do not need to look far to see what can happen when the Security Council fails to act. Here in Dublin and across Ireland, our communities are hosting many thousands of Ukrainians who have been forced to seek refuge from Russia's unjustified aggression against their country. They need our support, and they're very welcome here. Their country has been subject to an illegal war with an appalling impact on civilians. It's hard to put a number on the number of people who've lost their lives to date in this conflict, but it's pretty close to 250,000 people in the space of 9 months. And I would say somewhere between 40 to 60,000 of those are civilians, women, children, men that have no military experience and certainly aren't wearing uniforms. And that just puts a sobering context around the reality of what we're seeing at the center of our own continent again, something that certainly as a foreign minister I never thought I'd be commenting on or trying to respond to in my time in office. Russia's invasion is an affront to the rules-based international order that emerged from the ashes of the Second World War. It's a grave violation of international law and a blatant breach of the UN Charter, which Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council, should feel a particular responsibility to uphold. In April, I stood at the edge of a mass grave in Bucha, just outside Kyiv, as the bodies of hundreds of civilians were being carefully exhumed. I spoke in the Security Council a week later and called on Russia to agree to an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, commit to negotiations, and respect the UN Charter that they have an obligation to uphold. Sadly, that call was not heeded. When I spoke to the Security Council in September, following a visit to Odessa, I made it clear that if we fail to hold Russia accountable, we will send a signal to large, powerful countries that they can prey on their neighbours with impunity. In other words, force change in international borders and boundaries by force and by military might. That is something that every country, and particularly small countries such as Ireland, should always fight against, for our own interests, but also for the interests of many others. And we're very conscious of the wider impacts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine too, in terms of global food security and indeed energy security. Taken together with the impact of climate change and conflict, we face a crisis that needs urgent action on an enormous scale. That is why we have further increased our humanitarian aid, including and in particular to the Horn of Africa and other severely affected countries and regions including Yemen, Afghanistan and across the Sahel. Ireland has been to the fore of efforts to ensure that Russia is held accountable for the invasion. With 42 other states, we referred the situation in Ukraine to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. We filed a declaration of intervention at the International Court of Justice in Ukraine's case against Russia. We have applied for leave to intervene in Ukraine's case against Russia at the European Court of Human Rights. We have supported action at the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, the Council of Europe and the OSCE. I'm proud of what we have done to stand up for Ukraine, including in the Security Council. But I wish the Security Council had been able to take more effective action than it has. There is a simple reason why it has not. Russia has repeatedly and shamefully used the veto to evade responsibility for its own decisions and military aggression. The need for Security Council reform was crystal clear for a long time before this invasion. It is now, though, more pressing than ever, and Ireland will continue to make that case. This was Ireland's fourth term on the Security Council. Every time we're on the Security Council, the world seems to become a darker place. I'm not quite sure why. The last time we were on, it was 9/11 and all that followed from it. This time it's Ukraine, it's Afghanistan, it's Ethiopia, and unfortunately many other unresolved conflicts like Syria, Libya, Yemen, and so much more besides. We were well aware of the veto and the Council's shortcomings before we ran for the election, but we chose to run because we still believe that it was worth it. Because despite its flaws, the Security Council continues to play a pivotal role at the heart of the multilateral system. It's far from perfect, but it's the best we've got. And because when the Council can find common cause and take action, it can deliver outcomes that have an immense impact on the ground in different parts of the world. Throughout our term, we have sought to be a thoughtful and constructive member. We've seen firsthand that with political will and a commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, the Council can still deliver results. Ireland's work, of course, is not done. In addition to our priority work on Ukraine, Syria, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, women, peace and security, Somalia, accountability, we're also working hard on new draft resolutions, which would help to ensure that legitimate humanitarian actors are not hindered by UN sanctions regimes. We're also active in negotiations to renew the mandates next month of important peacekeeping operations in the Democratic Republic of Congo and on the Golan Heights. We seek, as we have done throughout our term on the Council, to ensure that the mandates are clear, credible, realistic and informed by needs on the ground. We will be active until the very last day, working on the basis of the same principles that have guided us since we took up our seat. As we leave the Council, we look forward to maintaining our engagement on many of these issues and on the broader multilateral challenges. At the UN General Assembly, we will work towards the implementation of our common agenda and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, which Ireland was very much part of establishing. We're running for a seat on the UN Human Rights Council for the years 2027 to 2029 term. We will continue to play an active role in regional bodies such as the OSCE and the Council of Europe, where we've just finished our 6-month presidency. And of course, the European Union will remain at the centre of our foreign policy, and indeed we as a country, as we look forward to our next EU presidency in the second half of 2026, I think is more and more coming into focus. One of the other regrets that unfortunately we haven't managed to make as much progress as we would like on is in relation to Iran. And I'm happy to take people's questions on that if you would like. But as you know, we have had an unusually close relationship with Iran for the last 2 years in terms of contact and discussion, because Ireland has the responsibility, while on the Security Council, for the file that relates to the Iranian nuclear deal, or the JCPOA as it's called. When we agreed to take up that position, it was a file that nobody wanted to touch, quite frankly, because when President Trump decided that he wanted to end the JCPOA, that file became almost an impossible file to manage politically. We took it on because we felt there was at least a reasonable chance that there would be a change in the White House, which subsequently, of course, took place. And the US approach towards the JCPOA changed fundamentally in terms of trying to rebuild it and put it back together to ensure that Iran would not pursue a nuclear weapon. But unfortunately and frustratingly, despite the fact that we have been incredibly close with, of course, the states that are directly involved in those negotiations, to actually get a deal that could reestablish a functioning JCPOA. I think it's becoming more and more difficult now, given some of the other issues that Iran is feeling the pressure on in the context of providing arms into Ukraine, and of course in the context of how demonstrations and protests in their own country. So I just wanted to mention that because it's something that has taken a lot of my time and my team's time. We've visited Tehran twice, actually, during our term on the Security Council, and I have had many phone calls and meetings with my Iranian counterpart in the hope that we would find a path forward that I think would have been good for the Middle East region more broadly, but also for global peace and stability and improved relations. And I have to say, I think Iran has made decisions that have taken us backwards in those efforts. But I think it's something that, of course, Ireland will continue to focus on and try to make a constructive and positive contribution on if we can. So look, thank you for listening. I am conscious that was quite a long speech and it is early in the morning. So now probably to the far more interesting part of the day, we'll move on to questions. But can I just finally say that I want to thank my own team. The Department of Foreign Affairs is full of extraordinary people who are intelligent, hardworking, but most importantly driven, and in most cases quite idealistic as well in terms of the kind of world that they want to influence through Irish diplomacy. And I have to say the team of close to 50 or so people that we have in New York have done an extraordinary job over the last 2 years, often under real pressure from large, powerful countries not to say things. But that has not deterred Ireland from being, I hope, a voice for peace, for stability, for small countries, for the downtrodden, calling out injustices when they happen, even if that puts our teams under pressure. And I think we've done that. And I hope we'll continue to do that as a small country that has a voice that is far bigger than our size would normally demand. So to all of our teams, some of whom are here, Fergal Mythen currently leads the team in New York. He's been good enough to come back to be part of this seminar today. Sonia here in the front has, in my view, been an extraordinary leader during this period, particularly on Africa, but also on the Middle East, and has been a fantastic guide for me on trying to balance difficult perspectives that we need to put across. And of course, Joe Hackett, the Secretary General of the Department, has also led a team that I think has never lacked in motivation and has been remarkably efficient. So much so, actually, that when other small to medium-sized countries are looking to be on the Security Council, Ireland has become a sort of a go-to country to come and talk to take advice from. And actually, we've been asked to second people into other countries' teams in New York because of the way in which Ireland is now perceived as a highly effective and organised and capable member of the Security Council for the time that we've been on it. So to my own team, they're the ones that make me look good most of the time. I simply deliver the speeches that they give me. But apart from that, I am conscious that this is a very informed audience, and I really look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks very much for taking the time to be here.
Who would like to go first with the question? We have a microphone. If you want to raise your hand, anyone, and maybe if anyone has a question or a comment, would like to introduce themselves. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Rory Montgomery, former Irish diplomat. Thank you very much indeed, Minister, for that tremendous tour d'horizon. There's a lot in it, I think, that certainly I was unaware of, and I'm sure the public more broadly. And I think you've made very clear the kind of useful and important things the Security Council can do. But at the same time, of course, isn't there an irony in the fact that at the Fine Gael Ardèche of the weekend, you were talking about removing the third of the triple locks, which allows the UN Security Council, which requires the UN Security Council mandate for peacekeeping abroad. I have to say, I think you're entirely correct in that. But doesn't that really point to the fact that at the heart of the Security Council, there are these enormous, and I would argue probably insuperable challenges for the period ahead? I became the political director in the department in 2005. There were proposals from Kofi Annan at that time for the reform of the Security Council. I was told at the end of July that a vote was imminent on reform. 17 years later, I don't know if it's imminent, but certainly it hasn't happened in the interim. And we have a situation again where major members of the Security Council have egregiously breached, as you say, international peace and security. Whatever one may think about the US invasion of Iraq, in addition to Russia and Ukraine, of course. So in a way, while there's a great deal that can be usefully done, at the same time, the UN Security Council seems unable to reform itself, and seems, despite the changes you've mentioned, and in reality is not really at the center of the absolutely major and really difficult security and foreign policy issues of the day, for all the good work that it does. And of course, since I think most of the people working on UN issues, I can only say I know the huge amount of work that went into planning and preparing and now implementing our place under your leadership. So congratulations to the all.
Yeah. Well, could I just comment on the sort of functionality of the Security Council first? I mean, I think in some ways the difference between what small countries that are elected members there on a temporary basis are looking to do in the Security Council and what the P5 are doing on the Security Council is often quite different from my experience in terms of motivation. So I think some countries see the Security Council as a way of advancing their own interests and their own agendas. And there are some countries that are on the Security Council to try and change the world for the better, and they are two quite different forces for change and action. And that is, of course, because all of the P5 have such interests across the world that it's rare that there's a major conflict where one or more, and normally multiple, members of the P5 have a direct interest, and often a direct involvement in terms of either funding or military engagement or whatever. I mean, if you look at Syria, for example, it is perhaps the most tragic example, but increasingly, of course, Ukraine now as well. How does a body that is actually put in place to prevent conflict, solve conflict, when the permanent 5 members that have a veto are directly involved in those conflicts themselves? And I mean, this is the fundamental contradiction of the Security Council. So, when something happens in a country that is not on the Security Council, if there's a conflict or a civil war or something like that, then I think it can be remarkably effective. So, for example, even though there P5 members and others on the Security Council had a direct involvement in Afghanistan, when Afghanistan began to implode again and Western forces left and so on, there was still the capacity of the Security Council to actually agree virtually unanimously in terms of how we could try to respond to the takeover of Afghanistan, essentially by non-democratic forces again. And that actually was one of the better moments in the Security Council in terms of attempting to try to shape that outcome, not very successfully as it happens, but at least agreement was there. Whereas, unfortunately, in many of the other conflicts, I think the contributions on the Security Council that I've heard are about trying to shape the narrative to suit a political argument that is more about advancing an agenda of interest to the member state than it is about trying to build a consensus. And we've tried to be a bit different in terms of how we make our contributions, which is shaped by international law, by previous Security Council resolutions, by the UN Charter, and so on. Now, of course, sometimes we've had fantastic alliances with P5 members. With the US, for example, and Ethiopia, I don't believe Ireland would have been able to do what we managed to do in terms of shining a light on some of the human rights abuses and humanitarian concerns without the support of the US. And likewise, we've partnered with France on certain things, we've partnered with the UK on certain things. And we've had, I think, constructive conversations even with Russia at times in relation to trying to get agreement in terms of the Syrian humanitarian access issues through the Bab el-Hawa crossing. And of course, we've had constructive conversations with China too, on trying to understand how we can respond to the complexity of Myanmar, for example, which China has much more knowledge of and potential influence over than any other country. So we've tried to be a small country that isn't there to actually build alliances in our own political interest, but to actually try to be a constructive member of the Security Council that can bring countries together. But that, I think, sometimes, and I got this, and I won't say from what country, but I think sometimes the P5 see the non-permanent members almost as a kind of an irritant at times, that are trying to do so much in the 2 years that they're there because it's a privilege to be there, that they kind of only half listen to them sometimes. So, I mean, for me, the Security Council needs fundamental reform in terms of who's on it, in terms of who the permanent members are, in terms of, I don't believe we'll ever achieve a situation where the veto will be removed entirely. But a number of years ago, France tried to bring forward this concept that the veto would be confined to specific areas and wouldn't be used in other specific areas if, for example, there was serious evidence of war crimes or dramatic humanitarian and civilian consequences of certain actions and so on, that there wouldn't be a veto used to prevent a response or action in those kind of circumstances. Unfortunately, they didn't manage to achieve that. I mean, if you look at what's unfolding in Ukraine at the moment, you can potentially see why. So yeah, I would be pessimistic about the ability to get the kind of fundamental reform that we believe is needed, but nevertheless we need to keep trying, and we need to be continuing to ask the hard questions, and I think we will. On the triple lock, and sorry, I'll be quicker on this. I mean, look, for me, we had a very good practical example recently of something that could have been vetoed. The extension of the mandate for Operation Althea, for example, there was an expectation that this was going to be vetoed. It wasn't actually in the end, for a whole series of reasons, but it could have been. And the idea that Ireland wouldn't be able to contribute to a peace support mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina because Russia decides to veto, or some other P5 country decided to veto for whatever reason, to my mind is fundamentally undemocratic apart from anything else. The idea that an Irish Parliament and an Irish government couldn't actually decide to participate in a peacekeeping mission if we wanted to, and if the conditions were right for that, because one of the P5 members decides to veto the Security Council resolution. Like, as it happens, I think the triple lock has served us very well, because I can't think of a practical example of where an Irish government or an Irish minister or the Irish Parliament has been prevented from sending peacekeepers to a part of the world. But I think the world has changed, and it is very realistic now that appropriate interventions that we should be part of could have to go ahead without a Security Council mandate because of the use of the veto. And I don't believe Ireland should be a prisoner to that. So while the triple lock has been very useful, I think, in terms of providing reassurance around the protection of Irish neutrality or military non-alignment, or however you want to refer to it, and I understand that. I think it's up to me now to actually come up with a proposal that continues to provide that level of reassurance in terms of Irish independence, neutrality, non-alignment, but at the same time allows us to make decisions, to be a proactive country that does choose to take sides, and chooses to be involved in inappropriate peacekeeping missions and post-conflict management situations and so on, without actually allowing ourselves to be sort of caught in this straitjacket that may result in, as a result of global political tensions and the use of a veto in the Security Council. You know, I think it's an appropriate evolution, if you like, of how we make decisions, that we respond to those realities, and that's why I've supported it. This is not a sort of a first step to NATO membership or anything like that. It's a very practical response to the new realities, unfortunately, that we see in the UN.
Thank you. Now, I know the Minister has other commitments. We might maybe just take one more question. Is that okay?
Do you want to take, if we could maybe take 3 short questions, and I'll try and give 3 relatively short answers, and we'll be done.
Absolutely, please. So maybe the 2 people, yeah, please proceed.
Thank you very much. Adekunle Gomez from the African Cultural Project. Thanks very much for the opportunity to hear about the work going on there, which we don't usually know. Now, the bit which struck me was the part on women's participation. And coming from Ghana, where we are taught to listen to our mothers, I was really, really delighted to about that thing, sending women. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that in Ireland, the Irish lad has to listen to his mommy. Now, short of suggesting that perhaps if men are being sent to conferences like that, the mommy accompanies him to keep him in line, I was wondering whether the bit you said about the women's delegation going there is something which is going to be permanent, that in future conferences, very important conferences, we make sure that women voices are heard by sending them. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And I mean, we have 2 people, maybe I think both at their hand. Yeah, the woman there and the gentleman next to her. Maybe if we take those two questions, please. And again, if you could keep your questions or comments brief, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Minister. My name is Rachel Nicaligher. I'm from Concern, and I just want to extend our thanks to the Department of Foreign Affairs and the teams, and also some of the work that the teams have done on counter-terrorism, carve-outs for humanitarian action and so on. But my question is, how much more effort needs to be made to address humanitarian crisis with 300,000 facing famine in Somalia and 100 million displaced? How can greater political engagement from a wider pool of member states be developed, and what will Ireland leave behind in terms of the member states that will carry the work forward? Thanks.
Please.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Minister, for your excellent speech. I just thought that it would be a missed opportunity if we don't mention about Ireland's role in strengthening Security Council Resolution 2475, on which my organization, I represent CBM Ireland. We're a very small organization in collaboration with International Disability Alliance. We worked with Irish Permanent Mission to the UN on strengthening Ireland's role on the issues of protection of people with disabilities in the armed conflict, which is something often forgotten. It's about 1 billion population that we are talking about, and Ireland has played a significant role in contributing in this area. So, and there's one opportunity that we are currently working from a civil society point of view, that since Switzerland being another almost a replica of Ireland, we might say, being small and willing to promote peace and security agenda, they are interested to carry forward this agenda of protection of people with disabilities in armed conflict, in line with Special Rapporteur Gerard Quinn's report on disability and armed conflict. So would Ireland be interested to kind of attend in a symbolic handover of its continuation of its efforts with Switzerland? We'd be happy to join in that effort from a civil society point of view. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me be very quick. First of all, to the last question, the answer is yes. We will, and we're already talking to Switzerland in relation to a number of areas where we expect them to sort of continue to advocate in some of the areas where we're working, and indeed other countries that are joining as well. By the way, not just Switzerland, but I think certainly in the area that you referred to and in Resolution 2475, that is something that, and it's in the same sort of thematic area as protecting civilians in armed conflict, in terms of people with disabilities. In terms of Rachel's questions and concern, yeah, I mean, we are hoping before the end of our term that we will get agreement on a resolution that we're effectively co-writing with the US on a humanitarian carve-outs for future sanctions decisions, which actually would be a remarkable achievement if we can get that agreed. Because the use of sanctions is always a really difficult thing to get right in terms of who and what they end up targeting. And so if we could get language that requires the putting together of sanction packages to look at humanitarian consequences in the context of, what are sometimes unforeseen consequences or unplanned consequences, I think that would be really good. So we have this week, I think, Sonia, do we have or Fergal, I should be saying, I think we have the first draft of that resolution that we're looking to try to get agreement across the Security Council on, which would be great. So that's something that I'd like to get done before we finish. And just on the broader humanitarian responses, look, you're so right. I mean, 100 million people currently displaced around the world. I mean, my God, when you think about that, and who actually those people are, most of them children, actually, often living in tents or in completely inappropriate settings. The humanitarian challenges that we face are enormous and getting worse by the year, and that's where I think, in many ways, the climate issue as an accelerator to conflict and tensions, particularly in places like the Horn of Africa and across the Sahel, where we're seeing desertification spreading, where we're seeing populations having to move because of lack of water and drought, and then adding to other displaced populations because of conflict and tension. You start to see, I think, an extraordinary humanitarian challenge unfolding, which is also going to result, by the way, in lots and lots of people looking to move and migrate to other parts of the world, which I think is also going to cause extraordinary political tension in terms of trying to accommodate the numbers that want the kind of lives that we take for granted here, and they can see the way we live on their mobile phones. And if you're living in a tent in a refugee camp, it's understandable that you would take risks to try to claim asylum in Europe or somewhere else in the developed world. So I think these issues are going to become intertwined in the future. Development, humanitarian assistance, migration, climate, and it's a debate, I'm afraid, that is deeply divisive within the European Union and in other parts of the world as well, which I hope Ireland can play a positive part in. In terms of our own commitments around funding the humanitarian response, we are now next year we'll spend over 1.2 billion euros on our overseas aid development program, which is the largest ever. We increased it by well over 100 million euros from this year into next. And our ambition, of course, is to keep growing that significantly. If you look at our commitment on the Horn of Africa, it's over 100 million euros between this year and next year. And I suspect we'll be doing more there as well. Other countries are doing a lot as well, but I think we are trying to respond. In terms of the women, peace and security agenda, and more broadly, the impact of women in terms of solutions to many of these challenges, can I just say, for the first time ever, next year, we will have more women ambassadors than we have men ambassadors in the Department of Foreign Affairs. There was a time, by the way, when there wasn't a single woman ambassador in the Department of Foreign Affairs. It's kind of hard to believe that that was ever the reality, but it was. And I think it's 52-48, I think, in terms of percentage terms next year. We've just announced our ambassadorial team of appointments for next summer, and they're so you know, I hope we're trying to lead by example in relation to some of these issues, and to be honest, not before time, given the talent that's emerging in the department and who they are. So yeah, and that obviously will result in more female voices and female leaders in terms of conferences like this one. So look, can I just thank everybody? I am very conscious that this is an audience that is very well informed on global affairs, but I hope that those of you who are Irish in this audience are proud at the contribution we've tried to make over the last 2 years on the world stage. I have to say, when Sonia and Fergal and Joe and myself were planning our Security Council priorities and so on, you know, it's like it's like in politics when you plan to try to create an agenda, and all of a sudden circumstances changes everything. That is what happens on the Security Council, I'm afraid, every time you're part of it. I thought Afghanistan was going to be the big issue that unfolded during my 2-year term. Then I thought Ethiopia was going to be the big issue. Now we have Ukraine, and it just shows what an extraordinarily volatile and difficult and violent world we're living in, and it's getting worse, not better. So the Security Council, I think, needs to reflect on that in terms of becoming more impactful and more efficient in terms of how it makes interventions, and how we can avoid the extraordinarily damaging use of the veto, not just by Russia, by the way. There are other examples of the use of the veto too, but in more recent times by Russia, so that the Security Council can do what it was actually set up to do, which is to make the world a more peaceful place and to make sure that small countries are protected from the kind of horrific scenes that we're seeing at the moment. So yeah, it's been an extraordinary privilege, but I think Ireland has done very important work for the last 2 years, and I'm very, very proud of the team of people who made it happen. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. So I'd like to just formally thank the Minister, firstly, for your speech, secondly, for being willing to go over time to give us your responses to questions, and thirdly, for your personal leadership in terms of leading Ireland's input to the Security Council and the UN, particularly in the last 2 years, but more generally. So thank you very much, Minister.
Thanks.
So just to say, to get on his way, because I'm sure he has a busy day, and we'll move directly to the next panel. So if I could invite Ambassador de Hyland and Dr. Renata Dwan to join me. And I think we should also have Richard Gowan joining us online from New York. Thanks. Hi, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
So, welcome to the second panel. Just to check, Richard Gowan in New York, do you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Excellent, and we hear you too. So that's great. So, this first panel is entitled "The War in Ukraine and the UN Security Council." What I'll very briefly do is introduce all three of our speakers, Then we'll go to brief presentations from the speakers, about 10 minutes or so. And then again, we'll have time for question and discussion. And I think we'll probably pick up some of the themes which were raised in the Minister's speech and in the Minister's responses to questions. So firstly, Ambassador Sonia Hyland is Deputy Secretary General in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and she has been, as the Minister mentioned, been very closely involved with the work on the Security Council over the last 2 years and more. Ambassador Hyland joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in 1996 and has served in Stockholm, Brussels and Madrid, as well as in the Development Cooperation Division and the Corporate Services Division here in Dublin. And she has also served as ambassador to Mexico and Ethiopia. Our second speaker then is Richard Gowan, who oversees the International Crisis Group's advocacy work at the UN, liaising with diplomats and officials at the UN in New York. Richard has worked with the European Council on Foreign Relations, New York University Centre on International Cooperation, and the Foreign Policy Centre in London. He's also been a consultant for the UN Department of Political Affairs, the UN Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary-General on Migration, UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Global Affairs Canada. And finally, I'm very pleased to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Renata Dwan. Renata and I go back a very long way. We worked together for a think tank. We won't even mention how long ago. Renata is now a senior consulting fellow at Chatham House, where she was formerly deputy director. For 15 years, Renata worked at the United Nations on a range of complex emergencies, including Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, Mali, and Syria, and also led UN-wide policy initiatives on peace operations and security sector reform. Additionally, from 2018 to 2020, Renata was director of the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. So you can see we have three excellently qualified speakers, and I'll hand the floor first to Ambassador Hyland, please.
Thank you. You want me to make some remarks first and then go on to do the Q&A?
Exactly,
right,
please.
good.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, thanks so much, and thank you to all of you here for taking the time to be here this morning. So I guess in 10 minutes to try and cover the entire issue of the war in Ukraine and the UN Security Council, I might say just a couple of things about how, as Ireland, we've tried to respond, and the Minister said some of these things already in his speech. I would maybe point to four particular aspects of our response that we've tried to highlight. The first is, I would say, you could almost describe it as a reality check. I mean, one of the things I think that has been really stark in relation to the Council and in relation to the discussions on Ukraine in the Council since February is the extent to which Russia has used the Council as well as lots of other arenas to spread disinformation. So you've seen, for instance, threats you've seen claims of Ukraine having a dirty bomb. You've seen claims earlier on of Ukraine and the US having bioweapons programs that were going to be spread by birds and butterflies. I mean, it has gone from the ludicrous to the extreme. And I think one of the things that the Minister was very keen to do, and I think has done very well, is to combat that sort of misinformation and disinformation, and particularly the use of the Security Council to spread that sort of disinformation by evidence-based engagement and intervention, including his 2 visits to Ukraine and then going straight to the Security Council after that to sort of bear witness and to talk about what he'd seen. So he mentioned, I think briefly in his speech, in April he was the first foreign minister in the world actually to go to Kyiv since following the further invasion in February. He went to Kyiv and he also went to see Bucha during that time. The excavations of mass graves and so on were happening in Bucha. That was just before Easter on the Tuesday. On Easter Tuesday, he went to the Security Council and specifically spoke about that. And again, I think that was a very powerful way to counter the Russian disinformation at the time. Similarly, the week before, high-level week in September, when there was also a Security Council meeting on Ukraine, but also obviously lots and lots of various different meetings around high-level week at the General Assembly in relation both specifically to the war in Ukraine and also to its impacts in relation to global food security. Again, he was very keen to go just before that, a couple of days before that, to Odessa and to specifically speak to both the Ukrainian but also the UN colleagues who were working on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, because again, there was a disinformation that Russia was using in terms of what the Black Sea Grain Initiative was, what it wasn't, who it was benefiting, who it wasn't benefiting. And again, I think he wanted to make sure that he had personal evidence-based engagement and brought that to the Council and also to the General Assembly. And I think that was very effective. So that's the first thing. Second thing is around accountability. And again, we've spoken about this a bit during the Minister's speech and during the Q&A. The Council has, I suppose, ultimately failed to hold Russia accountable because of the Russian veto, but a lot of other things have happened in and around accountability. So, for instance, Ireland has been at the forefront of joining Ukraine and joining efforts by Ukraine for accountability through the International Court of Justice, through the European Court of Human Rights, through the OSCE, through the Human Rights Council, through a variety of other mechanisms. And also, really importantly, I think the Liechtenstein initiative, which now, again, as the Minister says, obliges Security Council members, when they have vetoed a resolution, to go to the General Assembly and explain themselves. One of the things I think when you're on the Security Council, you're very tied into it and you're completely absorbed by it. But that's 15 out of the 193 member states of the UN, and everybody else is going about doing their work, not at the Security Council necessarily, maybe listening to some of the open sessions, maybe not. So I think it's really important that when countries veto something that other countries and the majority of countries want at the Security Council, that now they're essentially obliged to go and explain themselves in front of the 193. So that's been important, as I think has been the engagement at the General Assembly, because despite Russia vetoing a number of resolutions at the Council on Ukraine, the General Assembly has been able to pass resolutions, really important resolutions, including one which suspended Russia's participation in the Human Rights Council in relation to Ukraine. The most recent one, which I think had 93 or 94 votes in favour, was to establish a register of damages, which again allows then in the future Ukraine to look for reparations and has a sort of a formal blessing in a way from the Security Council, from the General Assembly to do that. The third thing I would point to in terms of the war in Ukraine is our focus on food security and the global impact. I think one of the things that you hear from many partners in Africa, in Latin America and in Asia, and not unreasonably, is there's a huge focus on Ukraine, but what about impacts on other countries? And this is a war and this is an invasion that of course is in violation of the UN Charter, of course is unacceptable, but many other unacceptable things and many other invasions and violations of the UN Charter have happened. So again, I think that's something that we've really focused on, is the food security aspect, the energy security aspect, trying to respond to that, including at EU level, trying to make sure that EU sanctions are not in any way inadvertently adding to food security and energy security issues. There's been a big issue around export of food, export of fertilizers, both from Ukraine, and obviously the Black Sea Grain Initiative has been really important there, but also in respect of fertilizer exports from Russia and making sure that they can get to third countries. And again, we've been very active in the EU to make sure that the sanctions, both the policy side of the sanctions and the implementation side of the sanctions, are clarified so that there isn't so that the EU doesn't add inadvertently to something obviously that's coming from the Russian invasion in terms of food security. And the Minister obviously mentioned as well the whole issue around all of the efforts that we've made in terms of funding for the food security crisis and the humanitarian crisis in the Horn of Africa. Maybe I guess the fourth thing I suppose is really to say that we have also tried to consistently work on a whole range of other issues and keep other issues on the Council's agenda that I suppose we see in Ukraine and we see as outcomes of Ukraine, but don't just affect Ukraine. So things like Rachel asked earlier, how do we get better at dealing and engage more at dealing with humanitarian crises. Again, we know that 85% of hunger is caused by conflict, and we've tried to work on those thematic issues, conflict and hunger, food security issues, women, peace and security issues, climate and security issues, all of the things that exacerbate conflict and that address the root causes are ones that we have continually focused on and we've continually engaged on. And again, I think part of that is because it's what we want to do and it's what we want to believe in, but I think it's also an important way to demonstrate that the Ukraine issue is a huge issue. It is extremely significant. We have to continue to focus on it, but it's not the only issue and it's not the only violation of the UN Charter that's occurring, and it's not the only place that civilians are suffering unnecessarily and where international humanitarian law, international law and protection of civilians are not being properly maintained.
Great, thank you very much. So I'll now hand to our second speaker, Richard Gowan, who's kindly joining us online from New York. So if you hear me okay, Richard, the floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope I'm still audible in the room. Good morning from New York. I'll take a sort of a slightly broader view of the Council in the context of Ukraine. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that it could be worse. When Russia began its all-out invasion of Ukraine in late February, I don't think diplomats knew whether this was going to be a crisis that could somehow be contained in the Council, or whether it was a crisis that would spread toxins across negotiations on other issues, be it peacekeeping in Africa or humanitarian aid in Syria. And in early March, it seemed quite possible that it would be difficult and perhaps impossible to keep talking to the Russians about a whole range of issues beyond Ukraine, and we would see the Council become paralyzed quite quickly due to the overall downturn in geopolitical relations. I mean, what is striking is that has not happened. Clearly, Council diplomacy over Ukraine has been massively time-consuming and absolutely horrible. And we have seen, as Sonia said, Russia using the Council as a platform for misinformation. But curiously, diplomacy on almost all other issues has somehow bumped along just about okay. The Council has passed roughly the same number of resolutions, I think about 40 resolutions, since late February, as it did in the same time period in 2021. Russia has only used its veto on 2 issues other than Ukraine, once in tandem with China on North Korea, and then once over Syria in the summer. Russia is abstaining on a lot of resolutions. Russia is certainly slowing down discussions on a lot of topics other than Ukraine. But at the end of the day, it is actually allowing the Council to do its business on most other crises. In some cases, that just means rolling over existing mandates. But in some other cases, the Council is actually innovating. We've seen the Council pass a significant new resolution back in March, setting a new framework for UN engagement with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Soon after that, the Council passed, with full support, a resolution reframing the African Union stabilization presence in Somalia. And then more recently, we've seen the Council establishing a sanctions regime for the gangs in Haiti, which is, I think, the first new sanctions regime to come out of New York for about 5 or 6 years. So if you were magically to take Ukraine out of the picture, and if you were just to watch what the Council is doing on other issues, you would notice that everyone is very unhappy, but you would still see that there is a continuing level of minimum cooperation going through this body. Now, this is striking, and as I say, it's not something that anyone thought was guaranteed at the start of the year. Why is it happening? I think we can identify a few reasons. One is that Russia does not want to completely close down the UN as a channel for dealing with the rest of the world. I think Russia still views the Security Council as a space where it can do pragmatic business with other powers, even in a period when overall diplomacy between Moscow and the West is in a sharp decline. Secondly, we have seen some of the permanent members of the Council making, I think, pretty strenuous efforts behind the scenes to keep diplomacy on track. That very much includes France, which has been very active behind the scenes, urging its partners not to let relations with Moscow collapse at the UN. But it also includes China. And we have seen China using its influence with the Russians, for example, over Afghanistan. There was a moment where it looked like Moscow could veto the renewal of the UN presence in Afghanistan, just largely out of ill temper over Ukraine. But the Chinese went to the Russians and told them not to be silly, not to confuse what was going on with Kabul with what was going on in Kiev, and the Russians did back down. And more generally, we frequently hear from diplomatic contacts here that the Chinese are out and about, being quite constructive, trying to keep council diplomacy going, which is also a striking and perhaps positive indicator about the role of this institution in a world where we're seeing not only competition with Russia, but also US competition with China going forward. A third factor is the looming shadow of the General Assembly. I do think that the sort of oversight from the General Assembly that was captured in the Liechtenstein initiative has weighed on council calculations. I think there is an awareness in the council that the General Assembly is watching, and that that is an incentive for Russia to behave a little better. Moscow, for example, doesn't want to be in a situation where it blocks the Black Sea grain deal. Western countries table a resolution condemning Moscow for starving the world. Moscow vetoes that, and then Moscow has to go to the General Assembly to explain why it is starving the world. The Liechtenstein initiative is a deterrent against the veto in that way. And the last factor is the good work of the elected members of the council, very much including Ireland. I think that it's been awfully frustrating to be an elected member of the council this year. But we have seen on a number of issues elected members stepping in to facilitate diplomatic compromise in New York to avoid a more general breakdown. Norway, I think, gets a lot of credit for that on some issues. I mean, it was Norway that was very much in the breach in the Afghanistan case, which I've already referred to, and I think Oslo gets a lot of credit for landing the important resolution this year on maintaining the UN presence in Afghanistan. But Ireland very much, I think, gets credit too, especially for the work around Syria in the summer. When working with the Norwegians, you guys were able to work out a tenuous but important extension of humanitarian aid into Syria. And then more recently, you were at the center of discussions on Bosnia. And as I think the minister said, a lot of us assumed that we would see a veto from Russia on the EU force in Bosnia, but that was avoided in part thanks to your good offices. So this has been a time when I think elected members have probably had a more significant role than in some other periods, greasing the wheels of diplomacy, getting compromises that the permanent members cannot get amongst themselves. And I think that you deserve a lot of credit for that. We can talk more about the rest of the UN system and Ukraine in the Q&A. I think that we have seen other parts of the UN perform better than expected over this war. I think that Secretary General Antonio Guterres has actually surprised us all by turning out to be a rather significant diplomatic player in the conflict, especially around the Black Sea grain deal. There aren't many diplomats whose reputation has improved in 2022. Antonio Guterres is one of them. And we can definitely dig down into other issues like the General Assembly if you wish. But I would conclude by coming back to this point that in diplomacy, it's always nice to do good things, but the most important thing is avoiding really bad things. And actually, the Security Council has avoided more really bad things this year than we might have expected.
Thank you very much, Richard. And it's nice in all these things which are often very troubling and very depressing to have a note of realistic optimism, if I put it like that. So thank you. So I'll now hand the floor to our third speaker, Renata Dwan. Renata, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Oh, and it's great to be here. It's also a hard act to follow both Sonia and Richard, given their very close connections to everything that's happening in the Council and being in violent agreement with them on most issues. So I'll just throw out a couple of thoughts. The first is, I think it is important, notwithstanding the points that both both speakers have made, that life has continued going on the Council. It's important not to underestimate the significance of the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, both because of the territorial integrity, the Article 2 that represents really one of the few fundamental unifying norms of the international order, and in particular in a more contentious space. The second is the Minister referred to the scale of devastation, but we haven't talked about, and I think it's important just to echo the threats of nuclear war that have been used. It is fundamentally a new direction to have, not one, not two, but repeated threats, suggestions, and hints of nuclear war. And I think I'll come back to what I think that might mean for the Council's future work. I do think we need to also be mindful of two other implications of the significance of the war. First is the scale of the response, including on sanctions. And I think that is fundamentally going to have a huge impact on finance and trade patterns and flows and governance thereof in the future years. And that might get to my point that I think some of the implications of the Ukraine war and Russia's invasion of Ukraine are going to be felt more outside the UN Security Council in other fields of multilateralism. And that's, I think, something really worth talking about that I hope we come back to. And then finally, I would just say I think the war has reinforced, if ever we needed to make the point, that we are now in a bipolar world, what some of our colleagues call an asymmetric bipolar world. It has reinforced the notion of this essentially order is between China and the US going forward and their relationship, and it has reinforced, I think, US leadership, particularly in the context of the Western alliance and in terms of marshalling response, and that will shape dynamics on the Council for going forward for many years to come. And I don't think that has come out as much as perhaps we might want to address. On the question of the significance being more on the multilateral agenda rather than other multilateral institutes than perhaps the Security Council, I would just point out to a few things. Notwithstanding the failures of the Council and the use of the veto on Russia, I would say two things here, or three maybe. The first is the Council was in crisis well before the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. I have to keep saying that because if you say the Ukraine war, our Ukraine colleagues rightly get quite upset. But I think since 2011, since Libya, since Syria, we have seen the Council finding it much, much harder to have unity on any number of issues and confronting a wider set of issues and concerns. And I think, just to echo something that the Minister said in the Q&A, it used to be that there were some key issues that the P5 could not agree on, but then quite a substantial amount of conflicts and peace and security issues on which they could agree well before Ukraine. In fact, well before even 2010, 11, 14, 15, I'm thinking of countries like Burundi and the crisis there. The Council found it much more harder to engage. And I think that's going to something we might want to think about the broader implications of internationalized civil conflict and polarized environments, meaning it's going to be harder to even agree what to agree on and what to consider in terms of agenda setting for the Council. So that crisis was there. But I would argue that the Council historically has never been good at looking at broad-scale, inter-scale crises. The Council had very little to say on Kashmir. The Council had very little to say on Armenia and Azerbaijan, including the most recent conflict. The Council has not found it easy to engage on Ethiopia and Eritrea's war in the 20 years ago. So there's a history there of finding interstate conflicts quite difficult. So what does the Council do that's good, and what is the area of focus, and how might Ukraine impact that? I think we heard a lot from the Minister, and Sonia echoed it. First, the Council really puts the bulk of its attention now on mitigating the fallout of war and mitigating the worst effects of conflict, human rights abuses, humanitarian response and crisis, accountability issues, and then deploying peace operations in support of a resolution, a stalemate, a ceasefire agreement, or some form of peace arrangement. And I think that will continue potentially, that focus on mitigating the fallout of conflict. But that's not an agenda for solving conflict, and it's not an agenda for preventing conflict. And I think in the context of the crisis that we see today, and the range of interlocking challenges we face, from climate security issues, from issues around pandemics response, from issues around thinking about sanctions and how to respond to them, it begs the question whether the Council is trying to do too much, and whether the spread of the agenda of the Council to look at both country crisis, thematic crisis, structural drivers of conflict, sharp crises, responses to conflict, and then peacemaking is too much for any council at any time, in particular for a divided council at a divided time. And I think we might want to reflect more on that in the light of Ukraine. What might that mean, therefore? I think that calls on issues that we heard just Richard hinted at, but I think we can perhaps discuss more in the discussions, but more focus on the role of other parts of the UN, agencies, funds and programs, Human Rights Council, Peacebuilding Commission, the role of ECOSOC, role of UNGA and the UN General Assembly in both being a voice to articulate issues, bring issues on from international attention, discussion, formulate coalitions, look at options for coalitions of action, and develop a normative role. Second, I think we're going to see a lot of focus on how does the Council engage with the bodies that are really handling the pandemic and the fallout of the economic and trade recessions that we see everywhere around us. I think that will require thinking about the role of the G7 and the G20. And what's the interrelationship between the Bretton Woods organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, the multilateral development banks, and other institutions? To what extent can we think about dialogue and engagement on between the Security Council, between the UN bodies, and forums for discussions in these areas? And third, you're already seeing the trend to look at issues such as pandemic preparedness, to look at issues around climate through other multilateral fora, but outside of the Council. So I think that's not to say that we shouldn't be alarmed or constrained about the situation, but I think the question is to put everything in through the lens of the Council. It doesn't reflect neither the reality of global challenges, the multiplicity of actors and institutions, but also where Ireland, after its coming off the Council, might focus some of its energy and engagement. And then finally, I'll just say that if there is a future for a council on a more narrow agenda, what might that look like? While I think the issue of arms control and the issue of nuclear weapons, the issue of strategic stability is certainly going to be on the agenda. And while the council might not be the body for those exposed discussions, it can certainly facilitate that quiet diplomacy that will be required from bilateral and P5 discussions and bring that on to the agenda and reassert the norm of the non-use of nuclear weapons. And I think that's a real role for a country like Ireland. Second, I do think there's scope for looking at the continuing issues of navigating the impact and the fallout of humanitarian crises. But I would just flag that speaking as a voice for accountability and articulating the impact of conflict on civilians, on vulnerable people, and on groups does have an impact and limit the extent to which the Council can be a peacemaking body. So it's not to say that there's an absolute tension between megaphone or between voice and between mediation. But I do think that the extent to which the Council seeks to articulate the needs of those most vulnerable and most impacted, and the impact of conflict on people impacts the extent to which it can be that peacemaking body and that power broker at the same time. And therefore, I think you'll see even more an attempt to use the quiet diplomacy off the record for significant peace relationships. So don't look to the Council to be the negotiator for large comprehensive peace agreements that perhaps we'd come to believe was its role after the end of the Cold War. So I'll stop there, but look forward to the discussions.
Well, that's great. Thank you, all three of you, for three really interesting and provocative interventions. So as before, we'll throw the floor open to questions and comments. We'll maybe take two or three, and again, we have a microphone, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. I'm Mary Van Lieshout from Goal, and I just wanted to raise one comment and one question. So very briefly, one thing that hasn't been mentioned so much today has been the deep engagement of the Irish diplomacy team on the Security Council with civil society over the course of it. Goal was one of many NGOs that really valued the reach out to us on a number of issues about what is happening on the ground practically, daily, and very clear, up to the date anyway, real-time information. So I was on 3 of those calls, one on Haiti, the crisis, 2, one on gender-based violence in Sudan, one on gender-based violence in South Sudan, and they were all private, confidential, deep engagements. What we learned in every one of those phone calls is the shrinking space of civil society in many of the countries across the world. I might agree with Renata that the UN Security Council can't do everything, but my plea is that you continue that kind of engagement, and certainly that you bring it into your work as a member of the Human Rights Council, should we be so fortunate to get there too. Because the human rights, oppression of human rights actors, in particular, gender identity actors on the ground, is something we just heard this whole time. And it's probably out of scope for the Security Council, but it needs to be in scope of your other work, and we really do value how you let those voices come in. My question is very brief. Who's going to call it on the Security Council resolution on the Baba al-Hawa cross-border crossing for Syria? We've got 6 months of crossing and yet more contention. The relationship between the Assad government and Russia plays large in this all, but will we see life-saving equipment going over that crossing? Does anybody have a view on how the new pen holders will manage that? Thanks.
Thank you. The gentleman at the front here, please. Just a thank you to the staff with the microphone as well, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Mohammed Salim, Ambassador of Egypt in Dublin. First, I'd like to thank the Minister for his very comprehensive overview of Ireland's role in the Security Council, as well as Ambassador Hyland, that we really appreciate. And they've mentioned both, that Ireland is a small country, but I have to say that it's standing very tall on the world stage, and their principal positions are being respected and highly regarded in many parts of the world, including in our region. I just have a question regarding Russia, because we've been talking a lot about Russia and the war in Ukraine since morning. And the Minister and also Ambassador Haaland, many others have already mentioned the resolution on humanitarian assistance in Syria. Russia is a very pivotal player when it comes to many files in the region, in the Middle East, for instance, and elsewhere. They're part of the quartet, they're part of the Security Council that's dealing with Syria and many other issues. The question is, how are we going to deal with that when it comes to those political portfolios? Because we've faced this problem in many meetings where basically our Western partners would not participate, let's say, in a meeting because of the Russian participation. So, for instance, a quartet where Russia is an integral part of it, or with Syria, how are we going to deal with that? Are you of the view that we can draw a line between the Western position regarding the war in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia and the Russian role elsewhere in the region? Or how are we going to do about those files in the coming period, especially that it seems that the war in Ukraine is going to be with us for some time? We all hope that it ends, but it seems that it's going to remain with us for some time to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a third question, please?
Thank you. I'm the Finnish ambassador here in Dublin. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting morning altogether. We tend to focus on the P5, but there are those 10 elected members, and I'm very happy to say that since the 90s, when I was in New York, they have become elected. They were called non-permanent. That was kind of very diminishing for their stature. Two questions related to that. What is the, I would like to ask Richard also, who has been studying also this on a long course. What is the capacity of the elected 10 to actually to cooperate, to put a little bit balance into it? Or is it difficult to, because they're also independent nations, to kind of act there? So that would be very interesting, because I think it's very forceful if they work together. And then the other thing is related to perhaps to Sonia and also Richard, the legacy of elected members. How important is that, and what has been in the history of the elected members? What are the key issues to make that membership having more kind of everlasting or longer term impact? Thank you.
Thank you for those three comments and questions. So, I mean, we'll go in the order of the speakers, and I think, just pick up the things that you feel most qualified to respond to. So, Sonia, please.
Okay, just very quickly through, they're all really interesting and difficult questions. On Bab al-Hawa and the Syria crossing, Mary, I mean, our responsibility for this goes until midnight, 31st of December. So we are working on this in the same way as we have been working on it from the very beginning, extremely intensively with all the partners that we need to be working with, including with Russia, and with full knowledge that basically if we don't do our job up until the 31st of December, it will be completely impossible for the incoming pen holders to do theirs up until the 10th of January, which is when the mandate expires. We're working also extremely closely with them. So it'll be most likely Switzerland and Brazil. That hasn't been formalized yet, as far as I know, but we're working with them consistently and constantly, so they know exactly what we're doing, who we're talking to, what we're saying. And so we sort of see it as hopefully a seamless relay. Again, it's not going to be easy, but it wasn't easy in July either. And to your question, Ambassador, we negotiated the resolution, the renewal of the Bab al-Hawa mandate in July, which was 4 months after the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. And of course, we had to have extensive contacts with everybody, including with the Russians on that. So I don't think the fact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine makes it impossible to speak to Russia. It makes it very, very difficult it makes it increasingly difficult and even more difficult than it was to get agreement on certain things. But as Renata said, the Council wasn't exactly all full of sweetness and light before the 24th of February either. So it was always difficult to do these things and always difficult to have these conversations. I would slightly disagree with Richard in terms of saying that Ukraine, maybe didn't have quite the impact that he thought in relation to some of the key issues. And Richard, you talked about Syria as an area that we were able to take forward. Yes, but it was much more difficult in July than it was in the previous July, not least because the US-Russia back channels had disappeared and they simply weren't speaking to each other. So it was actually, I would say it was more difficult, and I do think it'll be continually more difficult. And that relationship, that US-Russia relationship in terms of Syria and in terms of some other countries where they have had a pragmatic understanding and quite constructive back channels, the absence of that does make it more difficult. Again, having said that, we are continuing to engage. And one of the things I think is really important is the engagement with countries outside the Council, because the extent to which we can impact Russia's decisions is minimal, but the extent to which Jordan or Turkey or other countries can impact it is quite significant. So we have a very, very broad set of partners that we talk to all the time at all sorts of levels. And again, our focus will be to get that mandate renewed. And again, whether that's done just before we come off the Council or done just afterwards by us or by the next pen holders, doesn't matter. The main thing is to get it over the line. On civil society, totally agree. I mean, I think if you're not bringing voices to the Council of the people who are impacted, then what's the point? The Council is there for the maintenance of international peace and security, but what the maintenance of international peace and security means is individual human beings being able to live in peace and security. Otherwise, to my mind, it's irrelevant. So the sort of human security side of it, we don't really use that term. It used to be terribly popular. It isn't anymore. But certainly I think the way we come at it is the fundamental starting point is human beings being secure and able to live their lives in a sort of dignified way, and everything else sort of flows from that. So absolutely. And I think bringing civil society voices to the Council, I think, a number of countries in the P5 hate that. They think it's a waste of time. They think it's just elected members being sort of woke and performative. But, to my mind, if you're not hearing from people who are impacted, then you're not understanding the conflict properly and you're not trying to address it properly. I think I've sort of addressed your question, Ambassador, in terms of, how can we engage with Russia on these issues if we're not speaking to them. I mean, we are speaking to them. We are speaking to them in New York. We got the Syria, just for Ireland, for instance, we got the Syria resolution over the line in July after the invasion. We got the Althea mandate renewed 3 or 4 weeks ago. And again, Russia was a key stakeholder in that. And in terms of what we're now trying to do before the end of our term on the Council, getting a resolution over the line, which would provide a humanitarian carve-out for all of the 15 now sanctioned resolutions across the Council. Of course, Russia, like every other other P5 member and elected member is important, is a key stakeholder in that negotiation of that resolution. So I do think it's possible, although I do think it's also more difficult, let's say. What else? Capacity to cooperate with the E10 together. Yes, but I wouldn't overstate it, to be honest. I mean, the E10 are an extremely diverse group of countries with extremely diverse interests. We've certainly tried throughout the Council to sort of to promote E10 cooperation and to promote E10 sort of common positions and common platforms, let's say. But on certain issues, including sort of core thematic issues, if you look at climate and security, for instance, India is the voice that is most hostile, I would say, to climate and security on the Council, even more so than Russia and China. There's other aspects. There is other issues that are very important to us and where the majority of the E10 agree, but again, there are certain member states who don't. Having said that, I do think Syria is a really good example, where I do think in July, one of the reasons that we managed to get it over the line was that the E10 were completely ad idem and completely at one on this issue. And I think that did put pressure on Russia in particular. It used its veto, but then it did ultimately agree to less ambitious than we would have liked, but it did agree to a mandate renewal. So in certain aspects, the E10 are crucial, I think, and E10 solidarity or collective action is crucial. But again, I wouldn't overstate it. Just because you're an elected member, it doesn't, suddenly mean that you all agree on everything. In terms of the legacy of elected member states, I'll let Richard answer that in terms of history. I would say for us, two aspects that I would hope that we would have left a legacy on. One aspect is where we failed, let's say, which was the climate and security resolution. We didn't get that across the line. Russia vetoed it, but we got 113 member states to co-sponsor it. And nobody listening to the debate in the Security Council could have been under any illusion that what Russia was saying, which was this was a Western plot to sort of undermine and ignore the fact that we needed, the sort of the climate agenda in terms of things like loss and damage or in terms of things like financing. Nobody could have been under any illusion listening to the debate and seeing the number of member states and the breadth of member states that had co-sponsored it, that was just untrue, that this is something that actually people care deeply about. A large number of the member states that co-sponsored were from Africa. It particularly affects African member states. And I don't think the Council can continue to ignore climate as a driver and a multiplier of conflict for very long. And I think we've left that legacy for others to pick up, hopefully at a time when there's possibility of the Council being a bit more unified on that issue. The second thing, if we get it over the line, I think a big legacy will be the humanitarian carve-out, because again, if we have 14 sanctions regimes at the moment, I think, Fergal might correct me, I think it's about 5 that have a carve-out at the moment for humanitarian, but they're sort of different types, and it's 3, even fewer. There are different types of carve-outs. It's very difficult for NGOs to sort of work around them. They're quite complicated. They're not cohesive. If we can get a resolution that has the same type of humanitarian carve-out for every single sanctions regime, that will make a massive difference in terms of NGOs and international organizations trying to respond to humanitarian need, and then that would be a very significant legacy, I think, for us to leave. But I shouldn't re-say that, because in case we don't get it. But anyway, but Richard, I think, would be a better place to talk about legacy overall of elected council members. I think that's most of the questions.
Great, thank you. Richard, do you want to come in, please?
Firstly, let me clarify, Sonia. I didn't say that it wasn't difficult. And it's certainly true that, as I think I said in my remarks, the Council has found a lot of files harder to agree on than in 2021. But what is remarkable is not that the process was hard, but that there was still an outcome in the end. And if you look at the case of Syria cross-border, yes, it was a lot harder this year than in 2021. But if you go back to 2020, when Belgium and Germany was managing the file, it was probably actually harder to get an agreement then than it was this year. Russia played a really tough game in 2020 with the Germans and Belgians. So, as Renata said, the Council was in a mess on many of these files, especially files, sadly, in the Middle East before Ukraine, and that continues to be the case. Looking at the current renewal for Syria cross-border, I think we'll go through exactly the same game that the Russians played in the summer. The Russians will pay it out It will come to a last-minute crunch in January. It will go past the last-minute crunch. Russia will cast a veto. Russia will cast a veto in part, I think, to send a message to the Swiss as new council members coming in. And then there will be 3 days of panic, and then there will be a compromise. And, this is no way to run a humanitarian regime, clearly. Not a humanitarian regime that, involves about 15,000 staff and supports millions of people. But it's what we're stuck with. And I think we're getting a little used, sadly, to the sort of the messy way that it's run. On the question of legacy, I think Sonia has laid out a number of substantive issues that Ireland can be proud of in terms of a thematic legacy from its time in the council. My advice to outgoing council members is to enjoy an extended victory lap until about March. People will be interested in your sort of immediate memories of what has happened in the council in the early months of next year. It's a very good time to do lessons learned papers, to talk to countries, including countries such as Finland, which are just starting to prepare council campaigns about what Ireland has learned. But at some point in April, it all gets a bit stale, and people stop wanting to hear your war stories. And if you keep on telling those war stories, they get a bit boring. So there's a fine art in knowing when to stop the victory lap. But I do think that there's a mistake that some elected members make, which is that after leaving the council, they rotate all their council team out of New York. All those people who were doing exciting mandate negotiations are sent off to manage consular affairs in Paraguay or something, and a lot of talent is lost. And there's then a tendency to try and refocus completely on non-peace and security issues. There's an assumption that you're off the council, and so you should be focusing entirely on the SDGs. And I think that is actually an error. I think that you can continue to use what you've learned in the council for some time to come, especially in the current climate, as Renata laid out. We need countries with expertise on peace and security in the General Assembly, thinking about how to make the Liechtenstein initiative useful, for example. You need people in the General Assembly who can actually explain to their counterparts the best way to engage with the Security Council through that mechanism. And I think that's one role that Ireland could play. And then, in addition, you have the European Union. And there's an irony that at the moment, the EU's presence on the council is pretty small. This year it is you and France. Next year it will be Malta and France. You need to have countries other than France in Brussels tracking the Security Council and its outputs closely and thinking about how to keep EU-UN cooperation on a good track. And I think that's definitely something which Ireland has long been interested in, especially in terms of issues like peacekeeping. And I hope that you will maintain that interest going forward too.
Yes, Renata.
Thank you. And where Richard stopped, I'll take up just on the issue of legacy. I do strongly echo the point that to stay engaged in other bodies, and particularly around the food security issue in UNGA, particularly around the criteria in the council for calling debate under what conditions when a veto is used and when. But the third thing I would just say is the EU, and if we had had more time with the Minister, that was going to be my question to him, because since the departure from the UK, you have now one EU member as a permanent member of the P5, and you have less EU presence engaging on the Council. I've been struck about a couple of things about the Ukraine conflict. First, it's put the issue of UN reform strongly on the agenda, and including the issue of UN Security Council reform. The fact that Biden came out in UNGA this year at the General Assembly calling for reform I think, means that this isn't going to go away, even if we see some sort of management of day-to-day functions. And how can Ireland and the E10 maintain that? How can they bring their knowledge? How can they look at that so that the reform of of the Security Council debate is not just a reform about which member states get to be on the Council, because that's in a way the 90s discussion, but how the Council works. And not just on the use of the veto, I would also say on the use of procedures around what's on the agenda, how you sustain working groups, how you follow up on issues, that I think that needs a fundamental review. And I think much more use as well of working groups to manage what is a broader agenda, but often very little followed through. That links me to and if I may just say, one thing that struck me in the EU's strategic compass and these visions for the future that many states are putting out, integrated review from the US, Germany's coming out with an integrated review, the US has come out with its national security strategy. They're all talking about a global world changing, and many of them are putting a strong emphasis on partnership, including in the context of competition in a more competitive order. But very few are talking about multilateralism and global governance. I think the EU document mentions it once. So if the countries like Ireland want to maintain that focus of global order, how do you get a debate going now about what is multilateral reform going to look like, what is UN Security Council reform going to look like, and how does that engage? And that links me then just to the civil society and to the point, I think you're right. In fact, I would argue more than any of the agenda items that Ireland has handled very well, it has been that continuous focus of the civil society and in part of that bringing women that has brought that and has taken the civil society out from being that little group that gets consulted in an area formula meeting or in a preparatory discussion, but right into the council agenda. And I think looking to see how that can be made part of any debate on UN Security Council reform, procedural reforms would be critical. But I would just note that I don't think that's entirely easy an agenda item, and not just with P5 members. It's actually a very contentious issue with many of the G77, and we are in a space where we're seeing democratic backsliding. So I think that agenda on civil society engagement shouldn't be just seen as a nice to have. It's actually a really, really difficult agenda, and will get more difficult, I think, going forward. And then I just wanted to say one thing on the Security Council, on the resolution on Syria. I think Richard probably called it exactly right, the way it's going to go. But I would say it could get harder on the Syria, not least because I think, need to be very mindful about the fact that in the months since we've had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both Russia and Ukraine's war aims have continued to increase. Ukraine's position now compared to its position in February is a broader and more expansive one. Russia's position since the annexation of the 4 regions in Donbass and Luhansk is an expanded war aims, and that I think you might see a lot more unpredictability of how that conflict is impacting specific resolutions and decisions in the course of 2023, depending on how the situation on the ground looks, and depending how necessary Russia needs to look for more support from weapons and support, and how Ukraine needs to navigate its space. So while I agree that it'll probably get through, I would say it's probably going to be a lot more unpredictable.
Thank you. We can take a little bit more time if we have 1 or 2 more questions. If I might just abuse my chair's prerogative, one specifically for Sonia. I know, because I've had the privilege of a little bit of engagement with the department about this, partners in terms of, which countries have you partnered with, and, how has that been useful or interesting? And maybe to expand that to both Richard and Renata, if you look at the Security Council perhaps in particular, but also other UN institutions, where do you see the interesting, unexpected, creative partnerships or groups of states that are maybe pushing things forward in constructive ways? And do we have one more question from the audience, or please? So we'll take one more question there, and then we'll have our last round of responses.
Joel Hennessek, Maynooth University. Just perhaps a quick question on Iran, which was flagged in the minister's presentation, but just very briefly, with the ARIA formula earlier this month on Iran, would you have any reactions to council engagement, and perhaps particularly in light of Roberta Metzzola's statement earlier this week in terms of cessation of EU official channels with Iran? Thanks very much.
Thank you. So again, Sonia, please.
I think on partnerships, well, lots is the first thing to say, but maybe 3 or 4 to highlight. I think on climate and security, we had a really, really good partnership with Niger. I think we could not, neither country could have done what we managed to do collectively, and it was incredibly important to have a partner from the Sahel to work on that issue. And I think for Niger also, it was useful to have us, I think, to work on it. So that was a really important partnership. And also as well, one of the things that we're also responsible for on the council that doesn't get much airtime is UNOWAS, which is the Special Political Mission in West Africa, and again we partnered with Niger on that, so they were a tremendous partner. Mexico on women, peace and security, really important. We did, I think, again, sort of under the radar work in terms of chairing the informal expert group with Mexico and women, peace and security, but they've been a fantastic partner. And then obviously Kenya as well. We had the Kenya, Mexico, Ireland trio presidency on women, peace and security. Kenya, I would also mention as well on Ethiopia. Again, we've had very, very important engagement. And Niger last year and Kenya this year in respect of Ethiopia have been really key. On Syria, then obviously Norway, our partnership with Norway has been crucial in terms of getting the Syria file over the line. Those are the ones I would highlight, but I think there's others. Fergal could probably think of others as well. But I think in terms of who we worked most closely with, that was key. And again, off the council again is important. I mean, I would point, say, to Turkey in terms of the engagement on Syria. Again, that was absolutely vital to have a really strong relationship, more capital to capital than in New York actually, but that was a crucial relationship. And then the other question on Iran. I mean, do I think that the EU should halt its official channels for engaging with Iran? No. I mean, I don't think halting channels for all dialogue is ever a good idea with any country. It doesn't matter how egregious the violations that the country is committing. It just does not make sense. I think people sometimes confuse dialogue with agreement, and dialogue is not about agreement. Dialogue is about dialogue, and often you have dialogue for months and years that is frustrating and that doesn't result in anything, and that is deeply frustrating and doesn't seem to show results. But diplomacy is about dialogue. Diplomacy is about keeping channels open, including with countries where you have absolutely fundamental disagreements. And again, the Minister has often said this in respect of calls in Ireland to expel the Russian ambassador, now to expel the Iranian ambassador sometimes, or to not open our embassy in Iran. There's been calls previously to expel the Israeli ambassador. It just fundamentally is not what diplomacy is about. Diplomacy is about continuing to speak to people, including where you robustly disagree and where you are publicly robustly disagreeing. Again, dialogue is not about only positivity, but also dialogue is not about keeping your mouth completely shut and not saying anything to offend people because you want dialogue with them either. On Iran, I think there are multiple tracks that the EU and that bilaterally we have to engage on. JCPOA is one of them. Human rights issues are another. Ballistic missiles, Iran's use of proxies in the region, now Iran's provision of drones to Russia. So there's a huge agenda with Iran, all of which is deeply problematic, but it remains an agenda that needs to be pursued.
Thank you. Richard, please.
On partnerships, I mean, I think the one set of partners to add to Sonia's list that Ireland worked with, and it wasn't always easy, was the African group on Ethiopia. And I think that Ireland deserves credit for having worked with the A3 through 2021 and then into 2022 to try and find ways to bring a focus to Ethiopia in the council. I don't think that was always popular with your African counterparts, but I think that by this year, you see from partners like Kenya a real recognition that this was a necessary path to go down. And I think that something that we will continue to see in the Security Council going forward is the African three using their combined weight I think in a more effective fashion to shape council diplomacy, both on African affairs, but sometimes on issues outside the continent too. So it was very interesting to watch Ireland engage on that. On Iran, I mean, I'm not convinced that the best way to support civil society in Iran is through more Security Council meetings. I think that the history of Security Council engagement in support of public uprisings in the Middle East is not an entirely happy one. And there are more effective ways to provide that sort of support. But just to end on a small note of praise, I think that my colleagues who have been covering the JCPOA for years have always had a very high regard for the Irish team in New York handling Iran and handling your role as the file carrier on the JCPOA. It's something that has been noted as sort of good technical diplomacy, and I would close by paying tribute to Jim Kelly, your deputy ambassador, who you so sadly lost, who knew every wrinkle of that file and enjoyed every wrinkle of that file, and that was good diplomacy. And it's just tragic that Jim is no longer with us.
Thank you. Renata, please.
Thank you. And maybe just to echo, I think partnerships, it depends whether you're seeking a partnership to articulate an issue and bring it to public attention, or whether you're seeking to take action on an issue, because there are different partnerships. So where Ireland chooses partners or engages with partners to bring an issue onto attention, to express concern, for example, human rights abuse, accountability, that may be a different set of partners than the partners you seek to make the deal with in terms of taking forward an issue. And sometimes I don't think we fully sort of articulate that significance of a decision in terms of how that means with our partnerships. The second point I would just say is partnerships now have to be north-south and increasingly can't be global-north, that you really think carefully about partnerships in terms of selection of who to engage. And the third thing I would say is about partnerships inside and outside the Security Council. I wouldn't underestimate the role of partnerships outside the Security Council for progress on a Security Council issue. And I think in that respect, countries like Germany, countries like Japan have played important roles. Switzerland, even before coming on to the Council agenda, have been critical. And then I would just flag that I think it's really interesting to see some of the partnerships that you see evolving around the G20 now, the way Indonesia has sought to craft a sort of an agenda in a very difficult time. And I think Ireland sometimes underplays itself as a small power. It is the 27th biggest economy in the world. It is the second biggest trade surplus partner with China in the EU, next to Germany. And so I think thinking about those partnerships beyond the Security Council, it's important to also think about the issue-solving scenarios and how one can go forward on some of those key issues going forward. So I think plenty to do, including after you've left the Council and taken a good rest. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So unfortunately, we have to bring this panel to an end at this point, but I'd like to thank the three speakers. I mean, what came across, I think, absolutely clearly was the immense wealth of knowledge and insight on not only the Security Council, but the UN system more broadly. So I'm truly grateful to all three speakers for sharing their insights with us. Thank you very much. And just to say, there's tea and coffee at the back, and if people can try and do that in an orderly but swift manner. We're running a little bit late, but I guess if we'll try and start the second panel at 11:15, and I think you can probably bring your tea and coffee back to your seats if you promise not to spill it, I think. Thank you.